So our next session is on aquatic habitat restoration, and it's going to begin with a presentation by Dr. Paul Julian, followed by JoEllen Wilson, Barbara Welch, and Elizabeth Salewski, and a lightning talk by Kayla Hayes. So if each of you could start to work up to the stage, and you might want to go ahead and seat in that order. So Dr. Paul Julian, if you'll sit next to me, and then JoEllen, and then Barbara, and then Elizabeth, and then Kayla. All right, great. So I'm going to go and introduce each of these great speakers we have with us today. We're starting with Dr. Paul Julian of the Everglades Foundation. With nearly 2 decades of water quality experience in South Florida, he integrates knowledge of the Everglades ecosystem, water management operations, estuarine and wetland hydrology, biogeochemistry, and aquatic ecology to evaluate water quality and restoration progress across South Florida. JoEllen Wilson is the Juvenile Tarpon Habitat Program Manager for Bonefish and Tarpon Trust. She is a Punta Gorda native who grew up fishing Charlotte Harbor and went on to receive her bachelor's degree from Florida Gulf Coast University. JoEllen then completed her master's in Fisheries and Aquatic Sciences at University of Florida, where her research focused on juvenile tarpon habitat use. JoEllen oversees juvenile tarpon habitat research projects from South Carolina to the Florida Keys, focusing on nursery habitat conservation. All right, and if you can take your seats as soon as we're actually doing the panel, so go ahead and if you can find your seats after you grab your drinks and whatnot, that'd be great. Barbara Herman Welch is an environmental scientist with the South Florida Water Management District in the Coastal Ecosystem section of the Applied Sciences Bureau in the Water Resources Division. She has 30-plus years in the Water Management District with expertise in areas of water quality, oysters, and seagrasses in the Indian River Lagoon, St. Lucie, Caloosahatchee, and Loxahatchee rivers and estuaries. Additionally, she has extensive experience in contract management oversight for various projects in these systems and is currently working on the 3rd update of the National Loxahatchee River Wild and Scenic Management Plan. Dr. Elizabeth Salewski is a broadly trained benthic ecologist with over 10 years experience in habitat restoration and monitoring of coastal benthic communities, and her research interests include community ecology and invertebrate zoology, with a focus on the conservation and restoration of benthic habitats. She earned her master's degree in environmental sciences from Florida Atlantic University and her doctorate in biology from the University of South Florida. Dr. Salewski is a senior scientist with the South Florida Water Management District and currently leads the Submerged Aquatic Vegetation Monitoring Program for the Coastal Ecosystem section. Finally, we have Kayla Hayes again. She is the environmental specialist for the Florida Department of Environmental Protection at Charlotte Harbor Aquatic Preserves, where she has also worked previously to that as an adjunct professor and an environmental scientist. She received her bachelor's from Eckerd College and her master's of science in aquatic biology and limnology from Texas State University. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to you, Dr. Julian, to kick us off. And if there is a clicker, good.
Got it.
You're all set.
All right,
Thank you.
Welcome, everybody. First, I want to give a shout out to my co-authors here, Mark Thompson and Eric Milbrand over at SCCF. We put our heads together and data together to tell a pretty cool story, and this is only a fraction of the story. We're putting together a paper, hopefully to get it submitted soon, but let's dive right in. So it's kind of an obvious and a kind of understatement that seagrass ecosystems are vitally important, both from a fisheries perspective, but also from an ecosystem function perspective. Unfortunately, they're relatively sensitive to anthropogenic pressures, including water quality, which can mean nutrients, but it could also mean chlorophyll and other optical parameters that can affect their function. And of course, freshwater management also plays a really big key in marine freshwater or marine seagrass species in their ability to function. And generally speaking, to some degree, seagrass, as you would expect, since it's a plant, it needs light to grow. And so generally, seagrasses are relatively light limited. That little figure there on the bottom here is from a snippet from the oceantippingpoint.org showing the Florida Bay seagrasses. Now, Florida Bay seagrasses are obviously a lot different than our Caloosahatchee or even Charlotte Harbor seagrasses, but the general concept still states, kind of stays where seagrasses, if the water's clear and the light is moving through the water column, seagrass is pretty happy. The animals that live and depend on it are pretty happy, but and they're relatively productive. But if we have dark waters or nutrient algae-filled waters, the seagrass and their cohabitants kind of suffer a little bit. So light attenuation 101, right? So how the light moves through the water column is kind of an additive function of scattering and absorbing characteristics. So scattering from like turbidity or particulates, absorbing from, say, chlorophyll or even color dissolved organic matter. And that plot there is kind of a toy model that shows kind of how the relative light kind of attenuates as it moves through the water column from two different kind of waters. That dashed line is kind of the turbid / colored kind of water with a relatively high or KD or K coefficient, while that solid line is relatively clear water, so you get more light to the bottom faster. And of course, this is important to our photosynthetic friends down on the benthos that need light to be able to generate energy. And management actions ultimately can kind of affect that light attenuation directly and indirectly. And we have measures, I guess, we could develop to restore or improve that underwater light environment. And like I said, the light attenuation coefficient, or KD as we like to throw around a lot, gives kind of a metric of water clarity. So a lot of statistical models are out there, but one of the more famous ones is the McPherson and Miller statistical model that includes color, turbidity, and chlorophyll put together in a multilinear model to kind of calculate that KD, since everything is relatively additive. And we can take KD and there's been restoration targets or goals developed to kind of say if we have this amount of light attenuation or if we want this amount of light to the bottom, this is what the KD is going to have to be. And typically the rule of thumb is 25% is kind of the subsurface irradiance, or 20% in some cases, as kind of the benchmark we like to use. Now, since we're talking about the Caloosahatchee River estuary, we can't not forget our friends upriver. And so that plot on the left there is the Lake Okeechobee regulation schedule of 2008. There's lots of lines, lots of arrows, lots of bands. Needless to say, that plot is kind of an operational guidance for Lake Okeechobee and when to release water. And for the Caloosahatchee River specifically, that means the S79 or Franklin Lock. And so when water levels are high in the lake, the valves get turned on and water either comes to us, the Caloosahatchee River, south to the Everglades, or east to St. Lucie River. So ultimately the objectives of this study / presentation is to kind of evaluate those changes to freshwater inputs, big task. Develop a light attenuation model and maybe evaluate some of those changes to seagrass colonization depth. And so to do that, we kind of put together a multi-agency integrated data set of water quality data from the Water Management District, Lee County, and SCCF, hydrology data from USGS and South Florida Water Management District, and seagrass data from SCCF. Taking that data combined with what we have existing with bathymetry data and seagrass aerial coverage, we're able to put together a very interesting analysis and tell a cool story. Now, I've heard GAMS a lot in the past 2 days, which is weird because a couple years ago, we would never hear that. So general additive models are really cool, and they give us the ability to do lots of cool things. But essentially, what we did here is we took the KD, we adjusted it for light angles and time of day, and used a spatial and temporal general additive model to fit the data. And using just seasonal terms like day of year and year, combined with lat longs or location, we're able to predict or estimate KD throughout the Caloosahatchee watershed or estuary within our fitted, within our study period. And we can take that information, that's one piece of the puzzle. The second piece is this colonization depth. So taking a shout out to Marcus Beck up in Tampa Bay, he published a paper with his co-authors kind of estimating the colonization depth of seagrass using a kind of a relative iterative approach using a gridded kind of sampling design with seagrass coverages, and combine that with a logistic model, you can kind of figure out where the colonization depth for any given grid is, or any given point within that grid. It's kind of sample, subsample, and kind of look at it that way. So you can take that space-time general additive model plus the colonization depth equals a spatially explicit percent subsurface irradiance, quote-unquote, model. And so you just plug those two terms in, and you get percent surface irradiance. Now, the Caloosahatchee watershed and the Caloosahatchee River are relatively sensitive to watershed contributions. And so the plot here on the right, the top is annual rainfall per water year. The middle plot is the total discharges to the estuary, and with the watershed contribution as well as the lake contribution broken out. And then that bottom plot is the cumulative discharge that the 79 to, in this case, 2020, to cumulative rainfall. And the black line is the watershed plus lake. That white tannish line is the lake, and then that bottom, or no, I'm sorry, that's the watershed contribution, and then that bottom gray line is just the lake kind of broken out, so you can kind of see the different components. And throughout the years, we've changed how we manage water in Lake Okeechobee, which then means we change how the water is being delivered to Caloosahatchee River. And this is a 40-some-odd year period. For the most part, what we're interested in today's talk is the 2008 time period to current. But in the past, we've seen a lot of different changes, both from an operational perspective with different regulation schedules for the lake, but also from a climatological perspective, as well as from El Nino to La Nina, tropical activity, i.e. hurricanes, which are a pretty big deal, and droughts. So originally we tried to play around and develop a Caloosahatchee-specific multi-parameter model using color and turbidity and all that kind of stuff, and it really didn't work out. Big surprise, the Caloosahatchee River is relatively dynamic. And so because of that spatial variability and temporal variability in those parameters, it led us to this space-time GAM, which this plot here is effectively the GAM effect plots. And the way GAMs work, since it's additive, you can kind of break out each individual component. And so that left component is the day of year term, and these are partial residuals that are being shown. So it's all relative to one each other. It's not actual like what the KD is at any given particular month. It's all relative to itself. The middle panel there is the year term, and you can see these lines wiggle a little bit, and that's the smoothing factor, or the spline. And you can see, so for instance, in day of year, around day of year 271, which I think is like somewhere in June. I don't know, I'm not good with my days of year conversion. You see a relatively a higher KD value than, say, in the beginning of the year, day of year 30, for instance. And then for the middle part there, that's the year term. You can see how KD varies through the years. And you can kind of see it does a little wiggle. And that last little bit peak is kind of when Hurricane Irma hit. And then post-Irma, KD took a nosedive for the better, as in it was getting lower throughout the estuary. And then that final plot on the right there is the spatial kind of evaluation of how KD looks within the estuary. It's all relative. The darker colors being lower, or no, higher, the lighter colors being lower. And so up in the estuary, KD is really, really high. And we can do a little prediction here. This is just for 2010, an example using that. This is a GIF showing the progression of KD throughout the estuary. And what's really interesting is this model does a relatively good job of predicting KD through the seasons without using salinity or discharge, because discharge is seasonal. And so we get to be able to estimate KD relatively easily. And that being said, we can estimate KD anywhere in the estuary using that model. So using that, moving on to the colonization depth, we have seagrass coverage data for 2008, 2014, and 2020. And using that iterative model, we can kind of estimate what the colonization depth of seagrass is through those timeframes. And this is the lower Caloosahatchee area, San Carlos, Pine Island Sound, South Pine Island Sound. And you can see that the darker colors, the bluish colors, are deeper depths. The red or pink colors are shallower. And generally, throughout the years, colonization depth hasn't significantly changed. There are some pairwise differences, like between 2008 and 2014, but generally there's no significant difference across that. So seagrasses are kind of staying where they're staying. But if you look at the percent surface irradiance throughout that whole period, the color ramp kind of changes a little bit, with the orangey colors being low percent irradiance, surface irradiance, and then the bluish color being high. 2008 and 2014 and 2020 are all significantly different from each other, with an increasing trend in percent surface irradiance. And so what we can see here, this is a count of stressful and damaging events from 1979 to 2020 in this case. But like I said, for this study, we're kind of really focusing on honing on that 2008 to current. And you can see there's a trend line put through that. And this is essentially the count of stress and damaging events greater, so stress and damaging being greater than 2,100 CFS at S79, and it significantly increases, peaks at Hurricane Irma, and then deliberately, the Army Corps of Engineers adjusted the management of Lake Okeechobee and the discharges to the Caloosahatchee to kind of curtail some of those stress and damaging events after Hurricane Irma, because we learned a thing or two in that couple year period before Irma, but also because we had a lost summer of 2016, where significant discharges kind of caused ecological disruption, let's put it that way, where significant blue-green algae, red tide, all that kind of stuff kind of culminated into a semi-perfect storm of disaster, where we learned a little bit, and as we curtailed those discharges, things improved in the estuary, at least for seagrass, kind of. And so we can look at it too, also from a seagrass density perspective. On the left is the Haladuli for the upper, mid, and lower, as well as a control area. And on the right is the Thalassia seagrass densities. And in the upper portions of the Caloosahatchee River, there's a significant difference between days of stress and damaging events less than or greater than 120 days. 120 days seems to be a magic tipping point to where we see significant changes in seagrass densities. When we have less than 120 days, seagrasses kind of can handle the infrequent stress and damaging periods. That change for Thalassia is a little bit different, and it's more pushed down into the mid part of the estuary. And one thing we suspect, the reason why they're different between there, obviously, is salinity influences as well as light. So as higher discharges occur, we have typically higher color in the estuary, which affects light attenuation, which also affects salinity. So freshwater discharge conditions to the Caloosahatchee River has significantly varied over the 40, probably more decades, linked to climate, but also upstream water management with the changes in regulation schedules in Lake Okeechobee. More recently, with the increase in stress and damaging events, we've seen significant impacts to the seagrass communities in the estuary. And like I said before, high discharge equals low salinity and high CDOM. So imagine if you were stressed and you're trying to eat a hamburger. it doesn't really work. You don't enjoy it as much as if you were in the optimum conditions, say for seagrass, the good salinity and good light. But there's kind of hope on the horizon too. So if you've read the newspaper in the past couple years, you've heard about this new regulation schedule for Lake Okeechobee. It's called the Lake Okeechobee System Operating Manual. We got to have an acronym for everything, and it's got to change every time for some reason. But with this new regulation schedule, the collective we have figured out a way to manage the system, at least in model world. We'll see how it works out in the next 10 years in reality, where the discharges from Lake Okeechobee, the volume greater than 2,100, that stress and damaging threshold, is significantly lower in the preferred alternative relative to the no action alternative. And that's it. There you go.
The stress trying to eat a hamburger really resonated. I have 2 small kids, so I understand stress when trying to eat dinner. My name is JoEllen Wilson, and today I'll be talking about working with Charlotte County Land Use Planning to protect sportfish nursery habitat using a vulnerability index. And I'll go into detail on what we mean by that. So the economic impact of Florida's recreational saltwater fisheries is over $11 billion a year. But this depends on healthy and available habitats. It's estimated that Florida's lost about 50% of its mangrove habitats. On the East Coast, they are there, but there's just limited access, and that's due to how they manage for mosquitoes with the impoundment systems. Also, about 44% of wetlands lost in Florida, underscoring the hydrodynamic impacts and the hydrologic connectivity issues that we're seeing. So the 2 fish that I'll be talking about today are Atlantic tarpon. They're highly prized game fish. They are the logo on the CHNEP banner that we're looking at today. So especially to this region and to this area, we're pretty close to the tarpon fishing capital of the world, which is Boca Grande, Florida. So they're extremely economically and also culturally valuable. The other species is common snook. Again, these are culturally important throughout Florida. People are coming to Florida just to catch snook. They're also a species of interest by our state management agency, who every 5 years hosts a snook symposium, looking not only at snook stock populations, but also angler satisfaction. FWC is also implementing new proposed management regulations for snook, which includes multiple regions, which is fantastic when you're looking at all the differences that we see between the estuaries, and also including other metrics outside of just typical catch-in release data, including habitat and other red tide events. So tarpon spawn on the full and new moons, typically in the spring and sometimes into the fall. On our coast, they've got to go about 80 to 100 miles out to reach those deep waters, and tarpon broadcast spawn. Once the eggs fertilize and hatch, this is what your baby tarpon looks like. They are leptocephalus larvae, and they're in this phase for about 30 days, where they've got to make their way from offshore back up into the estuaries and inside the far reaches of these tidal creek systems. This summer spawning also coincides with our high tides and also our storm events that are helping to push these larvae up into the far reaches of these tidal creek systems. So once the larvae settle, then they metamorphose into these juveniles, which look a lot like what the anglers are fishing for, right? So snook and tarpon tend to use similar habitats, so that's why we're able to somewhat group them together in terms of sportfish nursery habitat, right? Because our state management agency is interested in snook, since tarpon are not a catch and release fishery, or tarpon are a catch and release fishery, right? But our donors are interested in tarpon. So because they're moving far up into these tidal creek systems, they're coming in really close proximity to us. And these nursery habitats are the most vulnerable to these threats, including nutrient runoff, so our lawn fertilizers, some of our golf courses, things like that. Also septic leaching. Charlotte County still has coastal communities that are on septic systems, and if it's below the water table, that effluent is leaching right out into our systems and into our estuaries. Also looking at altered freshwater flows, right? So disrupting that natural hydrologic connection. Habitat degradation or alteration, right? So shifting these into these retention pond type areas, and also total habitat loss through development. So there was a question yesterday during Aaron Adams' Mentee session where it says, what is BTT doing to implement terrestrial conservation? Here's one example. So BTT has taken note from what's going on in terrestrial conservation world, and we've implemented and started working on this framework of solutions that focuses on the habitat for the species, right? So first is infrastructure, so that's septic to sewer conversion. Next is freshwater flow management, so trying to maintain and preserve those natural hydrologic connections. And then finally, protecting the natural habitats that are left and potentially restoring the habitats that have been degraded. So if we're going to protect and restore habitats, first we need to identify those habitats. There was another question from Matt Bunting's session asking, hey, I know where there's juvenile tarpon. Well, we're the agency that are collecting these locations. So you'll see my email address on the last slides. Please reach out to me following the session. So in 2016, BTT began collecting juvenile tarpon habitat locations, really targeting on that 12 inches and under, because when you tell anglers that are fishing for 100+ pound fish that you're looking for the small ones, you know, that's not really what their mind's immediately going to. And also must be current locations. We see how much Florida's landscape is changing in our coastlines. So a juvenile tarpon spot that you fished, 20 years ago may not look the same that it does today. We ask those anglers to provide the exact GPS coordinates. Also, what size fish? If you're seeing multiple size classes, so maybe 6-inch tarpon mixed in with 10-pound tarpon, that may not be a nursery habitat that we want to mimic. So it's important to see what size classes are in those locations, what months out of the year. Are they able, is it in the ditch behind your house that dries up in the winter months, or is there a constant connection, or potentially those ephemeral ponds that have some conveyance sometimes out of the year, but what months out of the year are you seeing fish in these habitats? And then finally, we asked the anglers to classify the habitats as natural or altered. We received over 300 locations, and about 2/3 of those were already altered. So this really underscores the need for both habitat protection of the few habitats, natural habitats that are left, and we really need to look into habitat restoration. So 2 years ago, BTT received internal funding to do an extensive mapping project, and this was specific to Charlotte County and the Charlotte Harbor Watershed. That way we could suss out these sites. Natural sites were recommended for protection. The degraded sites are then prioritized using a restoration prioritization matrix that BTT came up with with layers using feasibility, right? Can we feasibly restore here? Is it privately or publicly managed lands? Is it in a DEP aquatic preserve? Also biology, are the larvae able to get there? Are there impediments from fish actually reaching potential nursery habitats? And then also connectivity. May be a really good suitable nursery habitat, but as soon as they move out of that system, there's not natural habitat available for once they immigrate. Okay, so in 2022, FWC hosted a series of workshops to create a juvenile sport fish management plan, and this was specific to Charlotte County. This was also a multi-agency collaboration. So FWC had different divisions: FWRI, Habitat and Species Conservation, Marine Fisheries Management, along with CHNEP was part of this working group, Conservation Foundation of the Gulf Coast, our local water management district, but also Charlotte County Land Use Planning was in this working group to come up with this widespread Charlotte County plan in order to protect and conserve these sport fish nursery habitats, because we know how valuable they are. So we had one side of the group that was research-based, right, looking at fish, the surveys, locations, lists of habitat characteristics, restoration design plans, but then we were able to look at merging that, right, with zoning and infrastructure. And really what this did was gave us a means to circumvent having to have these management protections in our fisheries agency and maybe go straight to the development agencies and figure out how we could mesh those two together. So that's when BTT suggested working on a vulnerability index. So what this would do was overlay the habitat layers, right? So the restoration prioritization, the natural habitats that we know about that were reported to us, also the hydrodynamic connectivity, we know how important that is. So not just the point-specific locations, but the natural watersheds that feed them. And then also those are inland and impacted as well. And then overlay those with potential development locations. So then you create almost this software program, right? So somebody goes into the permitting office, clicks on their parcel, and we have this vulnerability index layer or district overlay. And so they might click on a site and we got a red flag, it's high. So maybe we have a natural site that's at risk for development versus you may have a parcel that's already developed in a chain of parcels and you just got, one home that hasn't been developed yet on the street. Maybe that would rank low in the vulnerability index. So what are our options if we are flagged in the system? And this is really something that we're sussing out with Charlotte County Land Use. Right now there is a review process when it comes to developing by DEP. There's not necessarily one by FWC. A lot of times, especially in the commercial sector, when you're looking at coastal projects or looking at Army Corps, right? So we don't really have that fisheries component when you're looking at development plans. Also, density units, there's a set number of density units specifically in Charlotte County and also the Cape Hayes Peninsula. So density units meaning single home versus a townhouse or a condominium. And so you can move those numbers around. You can't get any more, you can't get any less, but you can kind of shift those density units around. Also, is there a potential for a development design that takes, water quality, these watershed flows, these sport fish habitats? Is there a way that we could design toward that? We've been doing habitat restoration designs, which don't really have a house in the middle of them yet, but is there a potential where we can feasibly, environmentally develop? We know development is inevitable, so how can we do it in a smarter way that's conserving these nursery habitats? Finally, is there a way we can implement species-specific regulations? In Charlotte County, we already have scrub jay regulations, where if you're building in scrub jay, you pay a fee, and that automatically goes to a scrub jay conservation fund for mitigation. We have gopher tortoise, right? So if you're building, you have to have a removal. Is there a way that we could have a juvenile sport fish layer or designation within this permitting? So one example is a proposed development project in the Cape Hayes Peninsula called the Rotunda Meadows. So the red and green, red means stop development, right? So think about this in terms of land use planning. So red meaning stop, green meaning go. So you can see where the proposed parcels or buildings would go. So, and then you can also see where the natural habitats are now. So maybe we want to shift those density units away from the red, where we have this kind of natural-ish wetland system, and then move it more toward the green, where we're already experiencing that ditching and, kind of that upland habitat. Another example is right along the upper reaches of these tidal creek systems. Maybe that's where we can start implementing the FWC, DEP, some type of plan or a way to develop that's environmentally conscious to these nursery habitats. Another example, although we're moving into Lee County, there's two seemingly natural-looking tidal creeks when you're looking from the coast. But as you move inland, the southern creek is already developed, right? So instead of expending efforts maybe to decrease the development or protect the rest of the creek there, development is going to happen anyways. Maybe we want to focus on that one versus the Red Creek, which that's Yucca Pins, and it's already undergoing hydrologic restoration by the Charlotte Harbor Flatwoods Initiative Working Group. This is also an opportunity to look at the hydrologic connections inland from this. So again, not just that point-specific nursery habitat location, but also the inland hydrologic connections and potential for land acquisitions. So the Vulnerability Index is currently in review for NOAA's Actionable Science Grant as part of a larger grant collaboration with FWC, CHNEP, Charlotte County, University of Florida, and the Fish and Wildlife Foundation. So the full proposal was submitted in November. Currently in June, we're waiting to hear back, and we should receive word in September if we'll receive the funding for the Vulnerability Index. I won't be able to take any questions now, but again, if you have any juvenile tarpon sites or any questions, please enter those in Menti, or don't enter the sites in Menti. Just send me your email address, but also take a picture of my email address. Thank you.
Hey, Okay, good morning. I'm Elizabeth Salewski with the South Florida Water Management District. Let me advance the slide real quick. Knew I was going to mess that up. We've been monitoring submerged aquatic vegetation for the last 15 years as under the Recover program, which is a component of the Comprehensive Everglades Restoration Plan. Our goals are to establish pre-SERP baseline conditions of submerged aquatic vegetation throughout submerged aquatic vegetation distribution and diversity throughout the estuary, as well as determine trends in SAV response to water quality parameters over time. Since 2008, our program, let me go back here so actually you can see where we actually do our monitoring. It's like walking and chewing gum at the same time. Since 2008, our program has evolved and expanded into to include monitoring at different spatial scales. All right. At the large spatial scale, our monitoring is conducted at randomly selected sites throughout the estuary, as well as aerial mapping, which will be a focus of the presentation today. And at a small scale, we monitor permanent transect locations to look for changes among different species over time. And now I'm going to turn it over to Barbara Welch to provide more information on our aerial mapping efforts.
What am I hitting?
You're hitting that one.
Okay. The South Florida Water Management District aerial maps the West Coast every 4 to 6 years. Oh, there we go. Aerial mapping takes place in the winter months on the West Coast between November and March. Careful flight planning includes pre-flight tracking of the weather and water conditions required to capture the best exposure of submerged bottom features. Imagery collected must be free of smoke, clouds, shadows, and haze. Additionally, flights must occur during high tide and calm wind conditions. Mapping development takes roughly 1 year to complete and involves many processes. After the imagery is flown, some of the additional tasks include accuracy assessment, which is an unbiased in-the-water visual check used for quality control checks after the draft map is produced. Photo interpretation accurately classifies and delineates mapped seagrass areas from the imagery collected, and ground truthing, an in-the-water field verification process accurately confirming photo-interpreted mapped areas. The West Coast mapping area encompasses the district's northern boundaries from Boca Grande at the southern end of Charlotte Harbor to Wiggins Pass in South Estero Bay. The area mapped has 8 inlets or passes and a bay, areas that can potentially cause turbid conditions delaying mapping efforts. The mapped area is also divided into 5 segments. In 2020, the highly qualified Dewberry Geospatial Mapping and Survey Services was contracted for the West Coast Seagrass Mapping Project. Unfortunately, unacceptable weather and water conditions delayed the project 1 year. The following winter, conditions improved and imagery was collected over 2 days, March 13th and 14th, 2021. The 2021 imagery flew 16 north and south flight lines, covering a total of 330 square miles, collecting 410 tiles or individual images. The final 2021 seagrass map documented 43,861 acres of seagrass. The map includes all continuous dense and patchy sparse areas of beds. The seagrass species mapped included manatee, paddle, turtle, and shoal grasses. For comparison, this slide shows the 2014 next to the 2021 seagrass map. Some noticeable gaps or losses stand out when visually comparing the 2 maps. To see where the changes have occurred since 2014, the next few slides will show where the no changes, gains, and losses areas occurred for each of the 5 segments. Starting with the segment with the most losses, sadly, of seagrasses in 2021 is the Matlacha segment. There was a total of 4,510 acres of seagrass mapped in 2021, noted in green. There was 410 acres of gain, those are noted in yellow, from 2014 to 2021. Though extensive seagrass losses in red of 4,178 acres, mostly seen in the mid and southern half of the segment. Next, we have San Carlos Bay, which had 6,127 acres of seagrass mapped in 21. In comparing 2014 to 21, there was 370 acres gained, with a major loss of 1,412 acres of seagrass. Next, we have Estero Bay. 2,867 acres of seagrass were mapped in 21, with 214 acres gained since 2014. Estero Bay showed a major seagrass loss as well, with 1,029 acres. In the tidal Caloosahatchee segment, 114 acres of seagrass were mapped in 21. Only 12 acres were gained, with 309 acres of seagrass lost since 2014. On a positive note, in 2021, 30,243 acres of seagrass were mapped in Pine Island Sound. From 2014 to 2021, Pine Island showed gains of 1,923 acres of seagrass, with 568 acres of seagrass lost. Pine Island was the only segment to show a net gain from 2014, as this segment gained 1,355 acres in 21. Key mapping results of loss and gain show that the Matlacha segment lost 46% of the seagrass from 2014 to 2021. San Carlos Bay lost 15%, Estero Bay 22% loss, and a major 72% loss in the tidal Caloosahatchee segment. Fortunately, Pine Island segment had a 4% increase in seagrass acreage from 2014 to 2021. Overall, after an almost 8% increase from 2008 to 2014, seagrass coverage decreased by nearly 10% across all mapped segments from 2014 to 2021.
All right, so now that you've seen a lot of those changes, as sad as they are, over a large scale, I'm going to focus on some of our small-scale monitoring results at two specific locations. We have permanent transects throughout the estuary, and I'm going to focus on our two more, our mid-estuary and our lower estuary transects. At each of these sites, which are circled in yellow, those little yellow dots, I'm going to focus on the yellow ones that are ringed in orange. At each of these sites, we have 3 parallel 100-meter transects that we use for regular monitoring, and we estimate percent cover within a quarter-meter quadrat at 10-meter intervals. From this, we also gather CRAS morphometric data, including canopy height as well as chute density. Let's see. All right. And since looking at both sites and looking at the total SAV coverage, I'm really just going to focus on the seagrass species. Since 2018, we've seen a variation in coverage over the years. At the lower estuary, which is indicated by the green bars, we had at least 20% coverage on average, which is about 5 times higher than what we see in the middle estuary, which is indicated by the blue bars. The key species include Thalassia, Haliduli, Halophila, and Serengodium. Some factors that may contribute to those, which Dr. Julian already mentioned, are salinity and light. Light's a big factor, especially in the Caloosahatchee. And a few things that I do want to point out, which I'm sure you guys aren't surprised by, but in 2020, all of our monitoring efforts were halted after after Hurricane Ian through February of 2023. And then I just wanted to point out as well that our 2023 data only reflects our March sampling effort. We sample quarterly, so not all of the data are represented here. So I'm going to take a look at the different locations by species now. So at our middle estuary, which is where we had a significant amount of loss in the tidal Caloosahatchee area that Barbara mentioned in terms of that major loss that we had, was dominated by Haliduli wrightii. You can see that there is some variation throughout the years, ranging from about 2% to 7% on average, so the coverage is still relatively low in this area. Haliduli does have a wide salinity tolerance range, so it is capable of handling the extreme fluctuations that can happen in this area of the estuary. One of the things that's also going on is we do have decreased light availability, which again was already mentioned, so thank you for that. It's good with teamwork, right? I like it. So with that, there is, between 2021 and 2022, there was a 4 consecutive month period where light availability was actually reduced. And that can be pretty significant for seagrass. We know that their plants, as already mentioned, they need light. It's really tough to get good light when you're underwater. So when light's even further reduced, it makes it even tougher to sustain and to maintain. So this middle estuary site, we did see some of that loss, and we're hoping it might recover, hopefully, but we do still have some seagrass that's there. At the lower estuary, we did have all 4 species that I mentioned earlier present. We did have Thalassia, which you can see is a nice lush quadrat pictured on the top right. We had a little bit of Serengodium in 2020, and we did have some Haliduli and Halophila species that showed up. The Halophila was only there between 2018 and 2019. We haven't seen it since at our transect sites. Doesn't mean it's nowhere in that area. It's just only at those permanent sites. One thing I also want to point out, in the year 2020, we do see this shift in dominance from Haliduli reidii to Thalassia testuninime. The Thalassia is indicated by the blue bar, the Haliduli is the darker green, so you can see that shift, and that might also be why we're not seeing the Halophila species, because Thalassia is a much larger blade. They can both grow very, very dense and thick in these patches. And one other thing I wanted to point out within this site, that bottom right picture, there's light going through. You can see my colleague measuring seagrass, but it's really turbid. It can get really, really rough, and the visibility gets really tough, so those seagrasses are really straining to get that light. So there's a lot of things going on in this estuary, but the seagrass is still there. It looked really good. We were just out there in June, and I was very excited to see all the seagrass that's there, so I'm keeping my fingers crossed we're getting good data. But overall, each individual species was still less than 20% at this site. And then overall, we did see that significant loss between 2014 and 2021, notably again at Matlacha Pass and in the Taita-Caloosahatchee area, which is where our middle estuary site is. The dominant species are Thalassia and Haliduli throughout, though their mean percent covers remain less than 20%. As we continue to monitor seagrasses in the Caloosahatchee, we want to continue to look at the relationships between seagrass cover and environmental conditions, such as water quality and light. And then our goals are to assess our long-term data through the investigation of relationships between the seagrasses, the water quality, especially as CERT projects are coming online. And then we also hope to increase our mapping efforts to every 2 years. And we do have a lot of people that we would like to acknowledge: Dewberry, Florida DEP, Florida Gulf Coast, Sanibel Captiva, Conservation Foundation, Lee County, and then of course Recover. And we cannot do this monitoring without all the staff at the district. So they put in a lot of effort, and I have to acknowledge them. So thank you, or we thank you.
Hi. Okay, so my presentation is going to be on the progress of an oyster restoration project on Cormorant Key in Charlotte Harbor. So I'm with Charlotte Harbor Aquatic Preserves, or CHAP. Aquatic preserves are state-owned submerged lands designated by the Florida legislature to be preserved in an essentially natural condition so that their aesthetic, biological, and scientific values may endure for the enjoyment of future generations. Our office manages 5 aquatic preserves in this area, shown and listed here. So CHAP manages these aquatic preserves by conducting various long-term monitoring programs to keep an eye on the health of the estuaries, such as seagrass surveys, colonial wading and diving bird monitoring, and water quality monitoring, to name a few. However, there is a need for restoration of some of these habitats, including oysters. So here's some background information on our oyster restoration project. So Cormorant Key is an island in Gasparilla Sound, Charlotte Harbor Aquatic Preserve, along the east wall, slightly north of the Pirate Harbor community. So Cormorant Key was severely damaged during Hurricane Charlie in 2004. It was once a thriving mangrove island, and then in 2022 was mostly just a sandy, shallow flat devoid of all mangroves. And you could see this in the aerial imagery pictured here. So this island is also a listed archaeological cultural site, which is threatened by erosion. This area was identified as a potential suitable location from the Nature Conservancy and Chenep's Oyster Restoration Suitability Plan. So CHAP partnered with Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation, or SCCF, for a restoration project utilizing fossilized shell to create an oyster reef. So here's some pictures of Cormorant Key over time. So post-Hurricane Charlie, there was still some mangroves in 2012, but by 2018, you can see they were mostly gone. 2013, you can see in that picture there that there are some oysters present around the island. 2014, some archaeological objects were found, some historic ceramics. And then in 2022, this is before any restoration occurred, and you can see it's just a sandy, shallow flat. So this project would not have been possible without volunteers. We had 55 volunteers from 11 different organizations listed here that helped shovel, transport, and deploy over 800 buckets of loose shell, which is around 12 tons, onto Cormorant Key in May of 2022. So this shell was donated to CHAP from the Nature Conservancy from a previous oyster project in the Peace River. So the shell serves as a substrate for spat, or baby oysters, to attach and grow to form dense clusters known as oyster reefs or beds. This oyster reef will help prevent more erosion to the island, may help accrue mangrove propagules, and will create fish habitat and help protect the cultural resources. So here are our monitoring methods of the reef. So after the shell was deployed, CHAP and SCCF went back out to Cormorant Key 6 months and 1 year after the restoration to measure oyster density and shell height. To do this, we collected 5 quarter-meter quadrats at Cormorant Key, the yellow star on the map, and 5 at a nearby reference reef, the green star on the map, to see how our restoration project compared to nearby natural reefs in the area. So here are our results. So I split this box and whisker plot into 4 groups. So the blue is Cormorant Key, and the orange is the reference reef. The lighter color represents the reef with spat included, while the darker color represents the reef without spat. So any oysters 10 millimeters and under were not included. So for example, the light blue is Cormorant Key with spat, and dark blue is Cormorant Key without spat. So from the 6-month check, Cormorant Key had noticeably smaller shell heights than the reference reef, which makes sense. It's a newer reef and not as established as the reference reef, which had older and larger oysters. But then during the 1-year check, you can see the shell heights are actually very similar. So here's the size frequency charts for Cormorant Key. So Cormorant Key again is in blue, and the reference reef is in orange. So during Cormorant Key's 6-month check, there's a larger percentage of smaller shell heights, between 10 to 20 millimeters, indicating it's a younger reef. And then during the 1-year check, you can see the size distribution starts to spread out and looks more comparable to the reference reef, although the reference reef still had a larger percentage of oysters between 30 to 40 millimeters. So here's our results for oyster density. Just a reminder, blue is Cormorant Key, orange is the reference reef. The lighter color represents reefs with spat, while the darker color is oyster density without spat. So during the 6-month and 1-year check, Cormorant Key had more oysters per meter squared than the reference reef, but had a lot more variability. So there appears to have been a large initial settlement event at Cormorant Key. And with restoration projects, restored oyster reefs tend to have greater oyster densities than the reference reef at the beginning because the oysters are smaller and take up less space, so there's less competition. Over time, the densities and size frequency will change and become more similar to the reference reef. So Cormorant Key appears to be following the pattern of other oyster restoration projects in this area with a large initial settlement event. If it stays on track with other oyster projects, oyster density will drop after 2 to 3 years and resemble those of the reference reef. Although Cormorant Key may be ahead of schedule, as shell heights are already fairly similar to the reference reef 1 year in. While this project has been very successful in terms of oyster density and shell height, it's still a small reef, and there's room to add more shell, which we would like to explore in the future to help our reef grow. So here's just some pictures of oyster spat on the fossilized shell at Cormorant Key, and some of the oyster clumps that form there. And then here's some pictures of the reef being used by different critters, some fish, sea hares, mangrove propagules, hermit crabs, and horseshoe crabs, and many more. And that's all I have. Thank you.
All right, at this point in the thing, I think everyone is familiar that we are going to go into Minty for our Q&A, and I know many of you have already started putting questions in there. I'm going to ask the panel, take your time. We have plenty of time for Q&A. Make sure to read each line of questions, and feel free to chime in on any, even if they're not directed to you. If you have something to add, feel free to do so. Thank you.
So the first one, what's the name of the paper? We're working on a title, number one. I'm sure it'll be something witty and fun. Is there an interest in expanding the optical model further up the Charlotte Harbor? If the data is available, yeah, we can explore that. That'd be cool. Does your KD estimates account for backscattering? It's not corrected for backscattering. It's whatever's been measured and corrected for time of day and sun angle. And do you need to account for colors, tannins when looking at light attenuation data inclusive Hatchie similar to what is done in the piece? I'm not sure what's done in the piece, but I know light attenuation differs with color, obviously, because that's a absorption component. So when it's measured, it's incorporating that component. I don't know if that answered that or not.
How do we scroll? Is it through that?
No, I think those guys scroll.
I'm going to go out on a limb and ask a question. We'll see if they kick me off the stage. But my question is for Kayla. So we've heard the last day and a half about the immense green filamentous algae that we've seen along the east wall of Charlotte Harbor. So have you seen any impacts from the filamentous algae on restoration efforts at your Cormorant Key project?
So the last time we were out there, there was some of that green filamentous algae present, but it really wasn't making too much of an impact, and especially after the hurricane, Hurricane Ian, we checked the site, and a lot of it had been washed away or covered by sediment. But our reef was still there, and it looked good, so there really wasn't too much of an impact.
Perfect, thanks. Do we scroll? Okay. Okay, so first, easy one, where can anglers share information about tarpon nursery habitats? You can email me directly, jwilson@bonefishtarpontrust.org. You can head to our website, btt.org. We work, as Aaron presented yesterday, we work very closely with anglers to build that trust. We work with people in the community, different agencies in the community, and obviously as a nonprofit, we're not subject to the same transparency issues that some of the other agencies have. So when we collect these nursery habitat locations, they're confidential, right? So we keep them. If we do present or share with the groups, it's typically in a very broad scale way. So even though we're collecting point-specific location, we're not giving that out. Is your habitat prioritization framework available for others to model and emulate on their own species and protection efforts? And I really appreciate that question being asked, because often we speak in terms of juvenile tarpon or juvenile snook in these mangrove-lined tidal creeks, but really what we're promoting is just a framework for you to use that for your own organisms, your own species, your own habitats. So that'll be part of a larger manuscript that'll be coming out. That's also looking at habitat restoration efforts. So again, that information is available through btt.org, but not necessarily in the scientific literature quite yet. You want to go?
Yeah, you can finish up another one.
Let's see. Oh, has any work been done that you know of looking at tarpon lepto travel from offshore into the estuary, coordinating with USF current modeling efforts? And I saw someone alluded to current modeling efforts done by USF in one of the questions yesterday too. So we do have current modeling. We actually are back calculating, looking at specific adult tarpon spawning habitats. So tarpon are coming to our areas, and the reason that we have these tarpon seasons in our area is because they form very large pre-spawning aggregations, or these large schools, and that's when anglers are targeting them inshore. Then they're moving offshore to spawn, and really these offshore leptocephalus catches are how we're learning where the spawning locations are. So there is a current evaluation, but we're also looking, so for example, we've gotten 2-day-old tarpon larvae, and we can backtrace those currents to look at where tarpon spawning sites are. So yes, there is, I don't know if it's necessarily with USF current modeling efforts, but we do look at tarpon lepto travel.
Don't want to step on everybody. So I think I can answer 2 questions in one. So the one question, can you explain again what mix of actual measurements and model data were used to generate the map layer of KD, how were and when were in the water KD measurements made? So the KD map layer, or that GIF that you saw of the KD go through, that was from the GAM model, using only KD measured at sites within the Caloosahatchee River estuary, from sites scattered from S79 all the way down to San Carlos Bay there, and using KD, the day of year and year combined with location was all plugged into that generalized additive model, and that's our output KD model that we put together. And it doesn't include salinity in that model at all, or discharge. So with that specific model, we're not too worried about autocorrelation with that. Answering that question, are you concerned about potential autocorrelations between salinity and light impacts? I mean, there is a significant impact with salinity and light, that just the push and pull of clear saline water versus dark freshwater. So there is cause and effect. I'm not exactly sure if we can tweeze that out in the work that we're doing.
Okay, next question. Did you use district land use land cover maps to determine natural habitats? And yes, we did. So FWC has basically a collection of land use land cover maps. And what we're able to do is use 100-meter radius for our point specific, and that's what tells us if that specific habitat is natural or altered based on the land cover classifications in the surrounding areas. And then as far as the connectivity that I alluded to, we looked at a 500-meter radius, looking at those classifications as well, and averaging if they were natural, urbanized, altered, and that's how we're able to get the point specific and the connectivity components. Oh boy.
I can take one real quick. The blue-green algae thing after Irma or Ian, I'm not sure there's been, I mean, now it's starting to pop up in the freshwater portions of the Caloosahatchee, but not necessarily downstream into the, I guess, head of the estuary. But Lake Okeechobee is definitely green, a lot greener than it probably should be this time of year. So there is some potential aftermath effect.
Okay, so other counties have worked with shifting density units with mixed results. It's something that was proposed in those series of workshops as a possibility. So Charlotte County Land Use Planning, they presented that to us and said, hey, this is kind of how it works. There's also kind of a credit system where people can purchase, especially if you're looking to do a large development project, you can purchase density units from other allocations. So that's not something that we've put into play yet. We're just kind of creating that brainstorming bullet list of, okay, what are our potential opportunities? But we haven't looked at it further. And then Also, have we contacted other counties? We've consulted on various restoration. As Teresa mentioned, we've been working a little bit with Sarasota County. Also consulted on other projects throughout the state of Florida and South Carolina, but we haven't specifically worked with Lee County, the conservation lands. We set up that initial habitat prioritization matrix to look at our sites that were just within that Charlotte County boundary, and only because that's what our donor or our funding source allocated that funding for. But again, it's supposed to be used as a test case, so that way we can expand that to other counties and other people can expand that to other counties and regions. And are there plans to engage the public for sportfish restoration? Always. And that's one of the issues when it comes to these restoration projects and protection projects. A lot of times when we're focusing on water quality, that's when we need to work with our sea grant agents, right? That's where we need to work with our new families that are moving to the areas and educating them on what they do in their yards is affecting our estuaries. And that's what we need to do with land use planning and our water quality, looking at that septic conversions. So engaging the public in water quality specific to sportfish restoration. When you're working on these design plans, we do receive input, but really that big picture is tying them into the cultural and economic importance of these sportfish in the community. The anglers get that, but trying to resonate that with the public is something that we do need to work on and engage them a lot more.
Okay, next question was, do you map the seagrass using the orthomosaic imagery or another method? Yes, we use the orthomosaic imagery.
Those are all aerial, they're all you.
Yeah. Let's see, from your aerial seagrass coverage map, do you physically assess these areas? Huge areas like Punta Blanca are completely void, and yet your map indicated total coverage. Unfortunately, we don't get over to the West Coast a lot, all the way from West Palm Beach. So we rely a lot on, like FGCU has provided input on reviewing the map when it came out, and DEP to tell us what they've seen. They're out there more frequent than we are. That's the best I can answer that. What constant do the seagrass mapping use in deciphering what is algal mass? And we don't map the algae. By the ground truthing, that's where they're able to, so when they put the draft map together, they have signatures. And they look at these signatures from the initial map, and then they go out there and verify what they're actually seeing. And then they create a key from that, so it is checked. What are some of the factors driving these losses and gains in Pine Island Sound? In checking with the individuals that are in those areas like DEP, I've been told there's a lot of algal mats out there that are shading out the seagrasses. I can't tell you that for sure from what I know, but from what information that has been shared with us.
To add to that, there's also, we talked a little bit about the salinity gradation and variation. That's less likely in the Pine Island area because it's more tidally influenced, right? So it's closer to the Gulf. Couple things that we do notice is that some of the losses that were in Pine Island, even though that was had the most gain, a lot of the loss that was in that area were near some of the inlets and some of the channels. So a lot of boat activity, a lot of wake and wave activity can actually generate loss because it's just too much for the seagrass to handle, especially if there's other stressors involved, like low light conditions. The algal mats, as Barbara mentioned, can also contribute to that. And at some of our sites, we've also noticed a lot of Lyngbia, which is a cyanobacteria. That also forms some pretty significant mats. And if you've ever removed that off of seagrass, the sediment underneath is pretty anoxic. It's got this nice black layer over it. So that can't be healthy for the seagrass either. So So there's a lot of factors that, it doesn't just go into water quality or light, which are two very big factors in affecting seagrasses, but it's also a lot of human impacts too, such as boat wake, prop scars. If you're running through a seagrass bed, that can also damage and remove seagrass beds. And then also we have things that we kind of can't control, like the algal mats and the Lympia, which, we can't fully control it, but we can mitigate it a little bit.
Why Pine Island Sound gained seagrasses? The only thing I can think of it's well flushed. My concern is, what did Ian do to those seagrass beds, which is why we would like to get out there instead of waiting to 2025. But unfortunately, funding is really slim, and so if we have any partners that want to contribute to us getting mapping done before 2025, we're open to it.
Yeah, and I think that would kind of go into the discrepancy question. I can't see the rest of it, but how we're giving updates on the actual coverage. So again, we do, I think it's Dewberry that does the ground truthing for us, is that right?
Yes,
So we rely on their information and their insights. We also rely on our permanent sites and what we see when we go out and do our random sampling throughout the estuary. We don't get as far out as Pine Island for our random, but that might change. Melanie, close your ears. That's my boss back there, sorry. So gotta wiggle that in there. So in terms of, that realistic coverage, again, we're 5 to 6 years in between mapping efforts. So we do lose a lot of information with that time frame, which is why we want to increase that frequency of mapping. Is there anything you want to add to that?
Nope.
Okay.
Partnerships. I know
Right,
everybody wants that seagrass map, counties, DEP, FGCU. So if you can help contribute in any way to get that, it's the cost of the seagrass mapping for 2021 was almost $150,000.
Yeah. So, and then as far as the machine learning for seagrass mapping and digitization, which I am exploring that, but I have so many other things that I need to address with this project that this is definitely, it is on my to-do list. And I really want to just get into that, but I need to get some other things with this project off my to-do list first, but it is on my mind and something I definitely want to take this project. Let's see. Absolutely. Please.
I think we need to scroll back up. Somebody said I was interesting. Or maybe they said my project. Somebody take a picture of that. So I should have said about the leptos in the currents using the USF models. We currently are in a contract with NASA looking at the potential for tracking leptocephalus from the spawning sites into the estuaries using current tracking. So that is on the radar. Oh yeah, this is a really interesting project. Oh, so close. I'm going to tell my family, though, that they said I was interesting. Yeah. And then bottom left there, is there any focus on a species besides snook and tarpon? A non-species specific method, is that more effective, kind of protecting the whole ecosystem? For us, that's kind of moving into the ecosystem-based monitoring realm, which for us, that gets really big and really clunky when you have kind of a lot of those variables. We've been focusing on the fish because one, as Aaron presented yesterday, they're kind of this charismatic megafauna, right? Using them as a flagship species. Anglers can get behind a fish. Anglers can't always, in our areas, get behind, the salt marsh habitats that we're trying to protect, along with those mangrove coastal zones. And then also we're using the fish to measure the habitat. We can do, as you guys see the issues that we have in the seagrass mapping and oyster restoration, sometimes it's hard to just understand those physical parameters of the habitat. But if we can use the fish to look at growth, how fast the fish are growing, if we can look at immigration rates, if we can look at abundance and survival, then we can tell how well a habitat is functioning and how productive it is without specifically measuring the habitat.
All right, so if we collect macroalgae, drift, and attach data, and how has macroalgae and abundance changed over time? We do actually look at percent cover for macroalgae and green algae like Caulerpa and other green algal species. I honestly haven't dug into those data just yet. We've got a lot of it, and we do see a lot of drift that comes through. I think our most recent sampling, where we were just at, our tidal portion, our lower tidal portion, we didn't really have a lot of drift at that site just recently in June. It was mostly Lyngbia. That was anything that was there, was that cyanobacteria that covered things. But it does, in terms of how it changes over time, that's something that I'm definitely looking into because it can impact the health of the seagrass and how well it grows. Let's see, 10,000 Islands, Everglades.
Yeah, I saw that one. Does the water management have any plans to use other tools such as single beam and side scan sonar for mapping? We do oyster monitoring using those tools, but not aerial imagery, seagrass mapping. For now, that just seems to be the best option.
So to add to that too, part of the Recover program, they did just develop a Southwest Florida module. There's multiple modules for the comprehensive Everglades restoration plan. And as part of Recover, we're all broken into models. So the Caloosahatchee falls into the Northern Estuaries module. So I'm pretty sure that Southwest Florida module team is looking into where those data gaps are and where those knowledge gaps are, where they can implement some of this monitoring. So this, I believe, from meeting that we had a few months ago, that this was something that they're interested in doing and pursuing, and hopefully when they get that online, they'll talk about that and bring that forth a little bit more. So stay tuned on that. Don't hold me to it, but I believe that was part of the discussion. And then terms and why we sample quarterly in the Caloosahatchee, in terms of annually. Right now, I think annually in Charlotte Harbor, those differences, I think it's just a matter of, we don't do any work in Charlotte Harbor. It is not in our water management district. In terms of quarterly, that's just how we chose to sample. We'd like to get out there at least once per wet and or dry season, and if we can get 2 data points within that season, in those seasons, that gives us a little bit more data to work with, especially with a lot of how things are changing. We want to try to capture that change on a finer scale, time scale. But that's just what our preference is. We had some sites that were monitored monthly, but we had to scale that back just due to resources and other projects coming online. Let's see. Colony. Can we scroll down just a little bit? Do you want to take the coordination with SwiftMud?
Capturing, interpreting aerial abundance data. It would be beneficial if both entities were using similar tools and methods for the same estuary system. Whoops. Talking to myself.
We all do it. You're in good company. Do you want me to take another question real quick?
Sure.
All right, so for the average depth, for areas that we're monitoring, and are all sites similar in depths, or does it vary? So our permanent transect sites, they actually vary in depth, and one of them is really highly tidally influenced, so we do get a lot of current that goes through, but that also happens to be our most dense seagrass site, which is the lower estuary, which you guys saw some of those data today. Our depth, we try to keep it around 2 meters, but we have seen some seagrasses that are a little bit deeper than that, but everything is usually shallower than that 2 meter mark.
I can answer the one real quick. Do you think the greater effect is on seagrasses is light or salinity? Can I choose both?
Yes. I think that's fair.
And it really depends on species too, right? So Thalassia obviously has a different salt tolerance than Haliduli, as well as it can handle light a little bit differently. And so it's a physiological species specific kind of trade-off. And also spatially too, like higher up in the estuary, you got to contend more with light, so that's why we don't have Thalassia. Lower in the estuary, I guess salinity kind of really is the driving factor, especially during the rainy season. And so, Thalassia can handle a little bit of changes in salinity, but there's enough light for it to thrive.
It's kind of wimpy with salinity. It is. So just to add to that, and on a different coast, I'm going to plug some colleagues' paper from 2021. Lori Morris et al. In 2021, they published a really great study out of the Indian River Lagoon that looks at light, temperature, and salinity as the three primary factors that impact salinity or seagrass abundance and cover in the IRL, but that can be applied to a lot of other areas. And they do have a lot of really good graphics and a long-term data set for you to look at if you're interested in looking at that paper.
Yeah, I could plug another area, Florida Bay.
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
Which temperature and salinity are
salinity,
kind
for
of
sure.
the drivers,
Yeah.
because the water typically, especially in the western part of the bay, there's not, I mean, there's enough light for anything to grow if it's photosynthetic. So, you know, Florida Bay is another example, and there's tons of data coming out of FIU, and the district has some, I think, down in Florida Bay, maybe contracted through FIU, I can't remember. But there's also another area to think about.
Yeah, there's a lot of good papers that come from Penny Hall and Brad Furman for that group. So yeah, the FAP study is really, so good call. Nice addition, yeah.
Speaking globally.
I like it.
So I think I did mention we do not map attached algae or drift algae using the aerial imagery. The photo interpretation, do you plan to use semi-automated classification techniques such as e-cognition? I don't know what that is. So you'll have to educate me on that, whoever put that out there. Our contractors might know a little bit about that.
Okay.
Finally getting to you.
Yeah, here we go. So Kayla, has water quality data been collected during this project? So I think the first couple of times we went out there just to assess that the location was suitable for oysters, we took our YSI and did readings, and the salinity and the elevation of the area looked good. But actually in the future we're planning on putting a continuous water quality monitoring station along the east wall. So that'll give us a better idea of the water quality in that area. Would you eat any of the oysters from the oyster restoration project? No. I also don't eat oysters, so that might, I don't know. How did the oyster reef do after Hurricane Ian? Great question. We went out there, I was super nervous, maybe a little flatter than when it was first deployed, but it looks great. There was a bunch of spat and good, healthy oyster clumps all around the reef. Was there opportunity to plant mangrove seed pods at Cormorant Key? So right now, Cormorant Key is still pretty low. So even to get to the site, we have to go at high tide just to get over the sandbar. And there's currently not like a suitable spot for mangrove propagules to be planted. I don't think it gets shallow enough for them. But we're hoping over time there'll be an accretion of sediment, and then the reef will also help accrue mangrove propagules, and then hopefully that could happen that way naturally. How stable will the reef be? Should mangroves be planted too? Yeah, right now the reef looks great, but it is small, and that's why we want to add more shell. There's more area there to add more shell, and I think that will really help make the reef be more stable. But yeah, it was still standing after Hurricane Ian, which was very exciting.
I'm going to just quickly address the Pine Island Sound versus the other areas that contributed. So we, unfortunately, just with our efforts and our timing, we don't actually monitor in that Pine Island Sound area other than the aerial survey. So it's really hard to say what's physically going on there, just to get that out there. And then in terms of plans for restoration, I'm sure there are people in this room that know more about the restoration efforts for seagrasses than I do. I just go in and plug and chug and get all the monitoring. But I do want to coordinate and touch base with a couple people in this room to figure out what everybody is doing. And I'm also interested in what restoration projects there are. I do know there's a Valleson area restoration project that was going on pre-Ian, but that was further upstream. And that's not, I mean, people would argue that that's not a seagrass, and I would argue. Yeah, I would argue too, yeah. So, but it's vegetation, so it's veg, it needs to be there.
It's grass that's in the sea.
Exactly.
One thing to add there, the Pine Island, why the increase is there, if you noticed on the map, they were pretty much scattered all over, so I think the beds themselves just increased in size. It wasn't any one area. And yes, we want to map more often, and 2025 at this point for our budget is how we're projecting. So if we can make it happen next year and you want to contribute money, we're here.
Nice, I like it.
There's a question, does BTT have any volunteer opportunities? Just visit us, email us, or our website at btt.org. Obviously, I'm working within Charlotte Harbor. I also have colleagues working in the Bahamas, and the Florida Keys, and Belize, and Mexico. So if you're available to travel, there's some bonefish work too that we can put you to work on.
Working vacations. You scoot it down just a little bit.
Airline fees not included.
All right, so the question is, do you think the 120-day threshold for SAV density loss could shift depending on changes in intensity of stress-damaging events? Well, yeah, I think so. If you have a lot more, then that threshold may not be detectable. If you have a lot less, same thing. The reason why the 120-day threshold kind of sits out is within the period that we were studying the seagrass, during that 6-year, I think it was, study, maybe 8-year, can't remember now. We had almost a natural break point, and I ran the statistics to double check that there was a 120-day threshold, and it popped out, interestingly enough. So it could change in the future, and it also depends on the species too. It depends on how much freshwater events we have, if they're stress and damaging, and if the species are changing or not. And if you scroll down, I'll finish that other one too. There's a lot of light attenuation data for Upper Charlotte Harbor. Can you? Maybe. It's an option. That would have to be a fun side project. If there's data in Charlotte Harbor, we can explore the development of a time and space model there and see how it works.
Do you know anything about the oyster beds in front of the Charlotte County Courthouse? No. So if you want to reach out and tell me about them, I would love to know. Thanks.
Yeah, I mentioned earlier the cost for mapping it in 2021 was, which was actually contracted in 20, was just under $150,000. I don't know what pole and troll zones are.
That's when they take the motor out, either push or have a little trolling motor that scoots you along.
So it doesn't props come up?
Yep. And I don't know if that was specific to my stuff or their stuff, but I would think it's their stuff because they actually measure coverage and densities. But I think there are case studies where that's been implemented in the Panhandle, and there has been positive movement to showing recovery. Yeah, I haven't looked at glyphosate in seagrass tissue, and I'm sure if it's floating around and available that it's in the tissues, but I haven't noticed it.
Actually, the St. John's might be looking at something like that. I thought I kind of heard that briefly from either Lauren or Lori Morris. Yeah.
Makes sense. There's the question, research in Florida Bay showed that seagrass species composition influenced benthic invertebrates and fish community composition. I'm not. Are you guys examining it?
We're not. I don't think through the district, we don't have any benthic and fauna studies that are going on. I would totally love that because, right? I mean, If you guys want to geek out with me later about benthic inverts, I'm your gal. I will totally go there. It doesn't matter if it's oyster habitats or seagrass habitats. I love them all. There is a lot of good information out there, and I do believe there are some, I would think that there are some groups that are looking at them. We don't actively do it, but it would be a great thing to include and to incorporate. We do have that on the East Coast in the Indian River Lagoon, but we don't have, for as far as recover goes, we don't have anything in the Caloosahatchee yet.
Sounds like a research gap that
Right?
some kind of research plan needs to address.
I'm all for it. Like I said, I will geek out about inverts all day. Seagrass coverage mapped every few years says intra-annual variability and seagrass cover introduce uncertainty. It can, with the mapping, so yes, it can, in terms of the intra-annual variability. With the mapping process, and Barbara could probably answer this better than I can, they do their flight patterns and they try to get out, once they have their ground truthing points in terms of the coverage, they try to get out and map or ground truth as quickly as the flight patterns as possible once we get that information.
That's accuracy assessment.
Well, that's right. So
Accuracy assessment is done first.
Okay.
And then ground truthing is done after they get the map completed. And they put it all together, and they look at problem areas and areas where there's showing seagrass and there wasn't seagrass from the previous year. Those are areas they will target.
So, and we can have some fluctuation, and we're still looking at differences between, so we do our, oh no. Oh, nice, I like it.
You asked, you shall receive.
Right.
You gotta learn to lie.
But we do monitor, nice, you should totally do it. We do monitor during the wet and the dry season through estuary wide, and I'm still looking at those data in terms of variability within the year and between years. So stay tuned for that, and hopefully I'll have some answers soon, like 5 years, less than that, but still soon enough, right? In a geological time scale soon.
So the aerial surveys, why aren't they not conducted during the growing season?
That's a really good question.
Yeah, the East Coast does it during the growing season in the summertime, and on the West Coast, I mean, I came into this first time in 2014, and I was told they do it in the winter months, and I believe that's because water clarity is better in the winter months. Can you confirm that, Chris?
Yeah.
That was my understanding.
Yeah, and the atmospheric conditions are clear too.
Yes.
Yeah, just better conditions all around, and you don't have as many storms to contend with either, because that's been thwarting our East Coast mapping, is a lot of the storms that we've had, so. That's a really good question, though.
Are there plans to plant mangroves, or will it be natural recruitment? We're hoping for natural recruitment. It's still maybe still too small of a reef, though, for that to occur just yet. What is the ideal depth to place oyster shell? I should probably know this. Eric Milbrandt would know this better than I would, but I think for Cormorant Key it was like 0 to 0.5 like elevation, but it really depends on the area because there's subtidal reefs up by the Panhandle. Any other oyster site restorations planned in the near future? I can't read what the rest of it says. Do you all share the restoration or monitoring data online or GIS layer? I don't, but the Oyster Integrated Monitoring and Mapping Program, or OIMP, or WIMP, does, and they have really great maps. Any other restorations planned in the future? We are hoping to add more shell to the Cormorant Key site, but I know Sanibel Captiva Conservation Foundation in Sanibel has other projects that they add shell to pretty regularly.
So for each speaker one, I think is a good one to maybe end on. The important actions you think is needed for sustainable habitat restoration. I'm going to take a page out of the Everglades playbook, right? So if we get the water right, our species and the species that depend on it will come with it. So that means for the Caloosahatchee, if we stay out of that stress and damaging category a lot more frequently, I mean, granted, it's going to happen. There are storms that we acts of God we can't control, but if we are able to curtail those stress and damaging events to let the resilience in the system build, then when those storms do come, we'll be able to weather them a lot better.
So to answer that question, took the words out of my mouth, water quality. So a lot of times scientists get into this rut about collecting data. We need to collect data, we need to get more data, we need to see what's happening. But I guess number one is we need to do it. That's the most important action. We need to do habitat restoration. We need to have a large scale plan so that we're not doing piecemeal projects, right? Creating these individual projects here and here. We need a cohesive habitat restoration plan, which I think we can achieve in Charlotte County. And then we need to do it, and we need to have clean water that's supplying these habitats.
To add to that, like, I'm going to concur with the clean water, and really with that, it really comes down to nutrient loads in a lot of areas. So I think, you know, the Caloosahatchee's not exempt from that, especially, so we really have to keep an eye on what we're doing with our own practices as, you know, as individuals and on a broader scale. So just from an ecological perspective, I think water quality, but focusing on those reduced nutrient loads would help tremendously.
I agree with everything that was said, and water quality is key, and water management, and the management of the water, that's helps with water clarity, salinity, which is highly important.
Agreed. But also, I do think monitoring is important as well, so we'll continue to monitor the estuaries.
Well, I think that's a wonderful way to conclude this panel, and I just want to thank all the presenters today.